I'm Sienna Maxwell, 25 years old, and in the world of high-stakes data security, a single digital fingerprint can either save you or destroy you. Today, my own family is trying to use my expertise to bury me, but they've made one fatal mistake. The gold-plated pen lay silently on the mahogany desk like a taunt. My father pushed the paper toward me, his gaze filled with pure disgust. "Sign it," he commanded, "before I decide to call the police." I stared down at the confession admitting to stealing $10,000 in wedding gift money from my sister right here at our Napa Valley estate. My entire family stood there circling me like vultures. My sister whimpered with staged heartbreak, while my brother-in-law wore the smug grin of a man who had just orchestrated the perfect frame-up. But as my eyes scanned the document, I almost let out a cold laugh. He had written that the theft occurred at exactly 11:15 p.m., a lethal specific detail that only the person who actually stuffed the cash into a suitcase could possibly know. I didn't cry, and I didn't beg. Instead, I leaned in surreptitiously using my smartwatch to capture a high-resolution shot of the draft, and that one expensive slip-up before setting the pen to paper. I needed them to believe I had surrendered. I needed them to become so complacent they'd think every trace of their crime had been erased. I stood up, tossed the paper back onto the desk, and let a faint, chilling smile reach my lips, one that made my brother-in-law visibly flinch. "It's done. You'll have your money back in exactly 48 hours. I walked out of the estate, the clock already ticking. 48 hours to turn this confession into a noose for the people who betrayed me. My story is only just beginning, and the truth is far more brutal than you can imagine. If you want to see how a data expert flips the script when the entire world turns against her, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell right now. You won't want to miss a single second of the most expensive revenge coming in the next 48 hours. The shimmering lights of the Maxwell estate usually signaled celebration, but looking back at last Sunday, they were merely a facade for a calculated betrayal. The air in Napa Valley was crisp, scented with the musk of crushed grapes and expensive floral arrangements. It was the wedding of the decade for my older sister, Tessa Maxwell. To the hundreds of high-profile guests sipping vintage Cabernet, she was the golden princess finally finding her prince in Grant, a high-flying broker. I moved through the crowd like a shadow, unnoticed and undervalued, but my eyes weren't on the champagne towers, they were on the structural flaws of the evening. Tessa had been obsessively meticulous about the logistics, especially the gift station. She insisted on placing the heavy mahogany gift box in a secluded alcove of the stone wine cellar, claiming it provided an intimate, old-world charm. As the security expert who had overhauled the estate's surveillance system as a gift for our father Geoffrey I, immediately flagged the location. That specific corner was the only significant blind spot in the entire cellar due to the massive oak fermentation vats that blocked the primary wide-angle lenses. When I suggested moving it 6 feet to the left for better coverage, Tessa had laughed a sharp, condescending sound that echoed off the stone walls. She told me to stop being a paranoid tech geek and to stop trying to ruin her perfect aesthetic with my clunky wires. The celebration reached its peak in the main ballroom, but the digital logs on my hidden interface told a different story. I had surreptitiously installed a backdoor into the cloud-based security layer months ago. It wasn't an act of distrust toward my father, but a professional failsafe in case the primary local server, the one Grant was so interested in, ever failed. Around 10:45 p.m., I noticed Grant's behavior shifting. He wasn't the jubilant groom anymore. He was a man checking his watch every 30 seconds, his face pale under the ballroom's crystal chandeliers. Exactly at 11 p.m., while the band played a booming jazz set and the crowd was distracted by a massive fireworks display over the vineyards, Grant slipped away. He gave a flimsy excuse to my mother about checking the temperature in the cellar to protect the vintage stocks. I followed his digital signature from my phone. He didn't go to the thermostats. Instead, he accessed the local storage hub. From my screen, I watched the primary cellar camera feed flicker and then freeze into a pre-recorded loop. Someone was manually overriding the system, creating a 10-minute window of digital darkness. I stepped onto the terrace, the cold wind biting at my shoulders, and found Tessa standing near the stone railing, looking not at the fireworks, but toward the cellar entrance. There was no joy in her expression, only a hard, predatory anticipation. When she noticed me, her mask of the blushing bride snapped back into place instantly. She sneered at the device in my hand, mocking my unhealthy obsession with work on her big night. She didn't realize that while she was busy playing the victim of my supposed neglect, I was witnessing the exact moment the trap was being laid. The night concluded in a whirlwind of feigned horror and shattered glass. The announcement of the missing $10,000 was perfectly timed, with the departure of the catering staff making the chaos look spontaneous. Because Grant had successfully paused the main camera, and because I was the only person with the administrator credentials to the hub, the narrative wrote itself. My family didn't need a thief. They needed a scapegoat to preserve the pristine Maxwell image. They thought they had deleted the evidence of their greed, believing the darkness of the cellar had swallowed their secret whole. They had no idea that my back door had remained wide open, recording every bite of their treachery from a secondary invisible stream. The drive back to San Francisco was a blur of gray asphalt and the lingering cold of Napa Valley. My apartment in the city, usually my sanctuary of glass and steel, felt incredibly fragile as I crossed the threshold. The silence was broken only by the persistent hum of my workstation, a reminder of the 5 years of grueling work I had invested into becoming a respected cybersecurity architect. I thought I had left the nightmare behind at the vineyard gates, believing that having 48 hours to gather my counter-evidence was a luxury. I was wrong. The betrayal didn't just want my family's approval, it wanted to erase my future. By 8:30 a.m. on Monday, the first tremor of the real disaster hit. I was reaching for my coffee when my corporate laptop chimed with an urgent notification from Slack. It was a message from Marcus Thorne, the head of human resources at Fortis Data Security. He requested an immediate video conference. My stomach dropped. I hadn't even logged into the company server yet. When the screen flickered to life, Marcus wasn't alone. Alongside him was Sarah Jenkins, my direct supervisor, and a woman who had been my mentor for years. Her expression wasn't its usual mask of professional encouragement. It was one of profound disappointment and confusion. Marcus got straight to the point. An anonymous, encrypted email had been sent to the executive board at 3 a.m. Attached to that email was a high-resolution scan of the confession I had signed in my father's study, the paper admitting that I, a senior security analyst trusted with millions of dollars in client data, had stolen $10,000 from my own sister. The message claimed that if Fortis continued to employ a confessed thief, the whistleblower would take the story to the industry press. The stakes had instantly shifted from a private family dispute to a public professional execution. "Sienna, we need to understand what this is," Sarah said, her voice strained. I watched her eyes, searching for a flicker of the trust we had built over dozens of successful data breaches we'd stopped together. But the evidence was damning. In our industry, reputation is the only currency that matters, and mine had just been devalued to zero. Marcus informed me that effective immediately, my administrative credentials were being revoked, and I was being placed on unpaid administrative leave, pending a full internal investigation. I was given exactly 48 hours to provide a legitimate legal rebuttal or a police report proving the confession was coerced or fraudulent. If I failed, not only would I be fired, but my security clearance would be permanently blacklisted. The call ended with a cold digital click. I sat in the shadows of my office, staring at the blank screens that had once been my windows into the world's most secure networks. Grant hadn't just framed me for the money. He had sent that email to ensure I had no resources to fight back. By attacking my job, he was cutting off my access to the very tools I needed to expose him. He wanted me desperate, unemployed, and too broken to think clearly. He wanted me to crawl back to Napa and beg for mercy. But he underestimated the resolve of a woman who has nothing left to lose but her dignity. I looked at the countdown timer I had set on my phone. 42 hours remained. The walls were closing in, and the air was getting thin, but the adrenaline began to override the fear. My career was on the brink of a total collapse, and my name was being dragged through the mud of corporate infamy. This wasn't just about a wedding gift anymore. It was about survival. I stood up, walked to my private non-company server, and began to bypass the first layer of encryption. The path forward was narrow and dangerous, but it was the only one left. The isolation of my apartment felt like a pressure cooker, the silence magnifying the betrayal that had now bled into my professional life. I stared at my phone for a long time before finally dialing the one person I thought might still have a shred of maternal instinct left. My mother, Sienna Maxwell, answered on the fourth ring. I had hoped for a voice of reason, or perhaps a secret ally who would tell me that the accusations were just a terrible misunderstanding. Instead, the air on the other end of the line was thick with a cold, rehearsed disappointment that cut deeper than any blade. "I told you not to call Sienna." She began, her tone clipped and devoid of warmth. "Your father is already in enough distress trying to manage the fallout at the vineyard. We've sent the paperwork you signed to the family lawyer. We just want this to be over." "Mom, listen to me." I pleaded, my voice cracking despite my efforts to stay composed. "The confession is a lie. I signed it because I was trapped, but I didn't take that money. Why would I risk my career for $10,000? Grant is lying to you. If you just look at the logs." "Enough," Glenda snapped, and for a second the polished facade of the Napa Valley socialite slipped, revealing a desperate, frantic edge. "It doesn't matter who took what anymore. The narrative is set. Tessa needs that honeymoon story to stay intact for her social standing, and I have already balanced the estate's ledger for the quarter." I froze. My mind, trained to spot anomalies in complex systems, immediately flagged the slip. "What do you mean you balanced the ledger?" There was a sharp intake of breath. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I realized then that my mother wasn't just protecting Tessa's reputation. She was protecting her own secrets. She had been dipping into the estate's operational funds for her extravagant personal expenses, and the theft of the wedding cash was the perfect way to write off the missing thousands. If I were the thief, the book stayed closed. If I proved my innocence, an audit would follow, and her own embezzlement would come to light. "Don't go digging where you don't belong, Sienna." She whispered, her voice now a low, venomous warning. "Accept the role we've given you. It's the only way you stay a Maxwell." She hung up. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the darkened screen as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. My tears, which had been threatening to fall for the last 24 hours, suddenly dried up. A strange, icy calm washed over me, replacing the frantic grief of a daughter with the cold precision of a hunter. I finally understood the terrifying truth. My family didn't need the truth, and they certainly didn't need justice. They needed a sacrificial lamb to keep their gilded cage from crumbling. I stood up and walked to my desk, my movements deliberate and devoid of hesitation. I opened my private laptop, the blue light reflecting in my eyes, which were now hard and unyielding. The time for explaining was over. The time for begging for a love that didn't exist was gone. I was no longer a victim waiting for a miracle. I was the architect of their downfall. I reached for my keyboard, my fingers poised like a weapon. The Maxwells wanted a thief. I was about to show them exactly what a high-level security breach looked like. The blue light of my monitors was the only thing illuminating the cold resolve on my face as I began my counterstrike. In the digital world, there is a saying, "Delete is just a suggestion." I had built the Maxwell estate's security infrastructure with my own hands, but as I attempted to log in, a crimson warning flashed across my screen. Access denied. My heart hammered against my ribs. Grant had been more thorough than I anticipated. He hadn't just changed the passwords, he had engaged a professional to scrub my administrator credentials entirely from the local server. Every trace of my authority had been wiped, and the logs from Sunday night had been overwritten with meaningless white noise. I leaned back, taking a steadying breath. Grant was smart, but he was arrogant. He thought that by destroying the front door, he had locked me out of the house. He didn't realize I had built a secret cellar entrance. Months ago, I had embedded a secondary undocumented back door into the firmware of the smart thermal sensors in the wine cellar. These sensors were designed to monitor the temperature of the vintage bottles, but I had programmed them to act as a silent bridge to a hidden encrypted cloud backup that bypassed the main hub entirely. It was a redundant system I'd installed for emergency data recovery, and it was my only remaining lifeline. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clicking sounding like gunfire in the quiet apartment. I initiated a low-level handshake protocol with the cellar's sensor network. For agonizing minutes, the connection hung at 10%, then 20%. I could feel the invisible resistance of the firewall Grant's hacker had erected, but they weren't looking at the thermostats. They were guarding the vault while I was coming through the vents. Finally, a green line pulsed. Connection established. I was inside the shadow server, a silent observer in the ghost of Sunday night. I began sifting through the raw data packets. The primary cameras were indeed blacked out, showing the frozen loop I had seen before. However, the system also managed the integrated dashcam network for the estate's fleet of vehicles. My father, Jeffrey, was obsessed with his 1965 vintage convertible, which was parked in the bay directly facing the side entrance of the cellar. Because the car was plugged into a smart charging station, its high-definition security perimeter camera was active. I bypassed the vehicle's encryption and hit the playback button for 11:15 p.m. The footage was grainy but undeniable. In the silver moonlight, a figure emerged from the cellar's side door. It was Grant. He wasn't the polished groom anymore. He was a thief in a frantic rush. He looked over his shoulder, his face illuminated perfectly by the car's motion sensor light, as he popped the trunk of a nearby sedan. He pulled out the heavy mahogany gift box, emptied the thick stacks of cash into a nondescript gym bag, and shoved the empty box deep into a recycling bin. Every movement was captured in crystal-clear detail, the timing, the face, and the undeniable proof of my innocence. A wave of cold triumph washed over me. I didn't just have a video. I had the metadata proving the file had been hidden and never deleted. I quickly compressed the footage and compiled a dossier that included the bank slip logs I had flagged earlier and the forged confession. I drafted an encrypted message to Detective Vance, a man I knew valued the truth over social status and my personal attorney. My instructions were simple and lethal. Do not move yet. I will provide the signal in exactly 48 hours. Let them celebrate their lies a little longer. I hit the send button, watching the progress bar reach 100%. The trap was no longer around my neck. I had dismantled it and rebuilt it around the entire Maxwell family. The clock was still ticking, but for the first time since the wedding, I wasn't the one running out of time. I closed my laptop, the darkness of the room finally feeling like an ally. 48 hours had passed, and the heavy atmosphere of the Maxwell dining room felt like the interior of a tomb. The fine china clinked against the mahogany table as my family sat in a silence that was more judgmental than any court of law. Jeffrey Maxwell sat at the head, his face a mask of disappointment, while Tessa and Grant sat opposite me, radiating a sense of smug triumph. They believed I was here to deliver the $10,000 and beg for my place in the family. Instead, I placed a small, sleek, portable projector on the table. "I'm not here to pay you," I said, my voice cutting through the tension with a cold, metallic precision. "I'm here to finish what you started." Without waiting for a response, I activated the device. The lights dimmed automatically as my wireless command overrode the room's smart system. On the far stone wall, the grainy but undeniable footage from the vintage car's dash cam began to play. The room froze as the image of Grant emerged from the cellar, frantically stashing the wedding cash into a gym bag. The timestamps matched the 11:15 p.m. window written in the confession, the very detail Grant had thought would bury me. Grant let out a sharp, mocking laugh, though his eyes were wide with a sudden flickering panic. "Is this your grand plan, Sienna? A poorly edited video with your tech background? Everyone knows you could whip up a deepfake in an hour to frame me. You're desperate, and frankly, it's pathetic." Tessa nodded fervently, clutching Grant's arm. "How dare you try to ruin our marriage with a manufactured lie? Dad, don't let her do this." I didn't blink. "I expected you to say that, Grant. That's why I didn't stop at the video." I tapped the screen of my tablet and a second window opened on the wall, a cascading wall of digital code and authentication logs. This is Layer 2. These are the encrypted metadata logs from the estate's local server. They show a manual override command sent to the cellar cameras at 11 p.m. The command didn't come from my IP address. It originated from your personal MacBook, which was logged into the guest Wi-Fi at the time. You used my administrative skeleton key, but you forgot that every login creates a persistent forensic trail in the cloud backup I designed. Grant's smug expression began to crumble, his skin turning a sickly shade of gray under the dim light. That proves nothing. Anyone could have hacked my laptop." "Perhaps." I countered, my voice dropping an octave as I prepared the final blow. "But how do you explain Layer 3? While you were busy hiding the money, you were even busier trying to save your failing brokerage account." I swiped again, displaying a series of leaked transaction records from an offshore illegal trading platform. At 9 a.m. on Monday, exactly $10,000, the exact amount stolen, was deposited into your account to cover a margin call that threatened to land you in federal prison. The blockchain path for that deposit is linked directly to a digital wallet registered in your name. The silence that followed was absolute. The air seemed to vanish from the room. Tessa's grip on Grant's arm slackened as she stared at the screen, seeing the undeniable evidence that her perfect husband was a bankrupt thief. But it was Jeffrey's reaction that was the most devastating. He looked at the bank records, then at the son-in-law he had championed, and finally at me. For the first time, the pride he had always reserved for Tessa was replaced by a look of sheer bone-deep horror. "Grant!" Jeffrey's voice was a broken whisper, the sound of a patriarch watching his empire of lies dissolve. Grant didn't answer. He couldn't. He looked like a cornered animal gasping for a breath that wouldn't come. He had underestimated the very thing he tried to use against me, the absolute, unyielding nature of data. I stood up, my silhouette cast large against the evidence on the wall. The hunter had caught the prey, and the gilded walls of the Maxwell legacy were finally coming down. The heavy silence of the dining room was shattered not by words, but by the sharp, authoritative knock at the estate's grand oak doors. I didn't need to check the security monitors to know who it was. My signal had been received. Detective Vance entered with 2 uniformed officers, their presence bringing a cold, clinical reality into the gilded halls of the Maxwell legacy. The warrant was for Grant, citing felony wire fraud, grand theft, and extortion. As the handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists, the man who had tried to bury my career looked less like a Wall Street prodigy and more like a common thief caught in a spotlight he couldn't escape. The fallout was instantaneous and devastating. Tessa began to wail, a sound of pure social despair, as she realized her perfect life had been a house of cards built on my supposed guilt. My mother, Glenda, turned away, unable to look at the daughter she had been willing to sacrifice to hide her own financial indiscretions. My father, Jeffrey Maxwell, looked aged by decades, his gaze fixed on the floor as the weight of his misplaced trust finally crushed him. None of them approached me. None of them offered an apology. But I wasn't looking for their regret anymore. I was looking for my resolution. I reached onto the table and picked up the paper I had signed 48 hours ago, the confession that was meant to be my professional death warrant. I looked at it for a moment, not with anger, but with a profound understanding of its powerlessness. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, I tore the document into 100 tiny pieces. I let the fragments fall like snow onto the expensive Persian rug. That paper was the last thing that tethered me to their toxic hierarchy. By destroying it, I wasn't just clearing my name, I was reclaiming my soul. Knowledge is the only currency that never devalues. I said, my voice steady and echoing through the hushed room. You thought you could use my skills to frame me because you didn't value the intelligence behind them. You forgot that technology is a mirror. It only shows the truth you're too afraid to face. This was the ultimate lesson. Justice doesn't simply arrive on its own. It is meticulously built through preparation, courage, and the refusal to be a silent victim. I had used the very tools they tried to weaponize against me to secure my freedom. I didn't wait for a goodbye. I walked out of the house, leaving the chaos and the flashing blue lights of the police cruisers behind. I climbed into my car as the first rays of the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the Napa Valley vineyards in hues of gold and amber. The air was fresh, no longer thick with the scent of old secrets and rehearsed lies. For the first time in 25 years, I was no longer a difficult Maxwell or a lightning rod for their failures. I was simply Sienna, an architect of my own future. As I drove toward the estate gates, I didn't look back in the rearview mirror. True peace doesn't come from forgiveness or a hollow reconciliation. It comes from the absolute severance from those who would rather see you fall than see themselves change. I pressed my foot onto the accelerator, leaving the shadows of the valley for the infinite possibilities of the open road. The wait was gone. The case was closed. My life was finally my own.